very much. I'm always really intrigued when it comes to things like this, because when you sit here and you take notes and you write things down, everything seems remarkably easy. And then you go back to the office and all of this stuff, you say, yeah, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be building more purpose into our jobs. And everyone just stares at you blankly. And I think that's how I found myself. I was working at Twitter, and I worked at Twitter for about 8 years. When we first started, it was a tiny little team. We could have fit into sort of the mystery machine from Scooby-Doo. We could have fit in a tiny little van and travelled around. By the time I left, there was several hundred people. But along the way, the path of building our culture wasn't linear. We started off with an incredible culture. It got better and better. And then along the way, some of the things went wrong, and I found that we were in a really bad position. And what I struggled with there, I set about going to pick up books. I set about trying to tap into other people's advice. What I struggled with was that sometimes some of the big concepts that you hear and some of the language you hear, I just really struggled to connect with it and know exactly what I was going to do. The idea of purpose, I could read chapters and chapters and pages on it. But when it came to actually bringing that to people's jobs, I found it immensely difficult. And I started doing this podcast, and then I sort of turned it into that book. There's 4 jokes in that book, £7 on Amazon. But to try and turn it, my feeling was I wanted something that was like a cookbook. That, you know, when you don't read a cookbook start to finish, but sometimes you want a risotto recipe, and you turn to that chapter, and that's what I wanted to do. Because I found that I was struggling, that some of the concepts we hear about were just difficult to connect with. And what I'm going to try and do today is I'm going to save you the time of reading that. I'm going to try and summarize some of the things I learned and try and make it as immensely practical as possible. First thing I realized was that we're in the midst of this sort of vast mega trend of there's a combination of 2 things going on at work right now. The first one is the fact that work has transformed from being a place we go to into a thing that we do. And I know that there's always been that duality of the meaning of work, but more than ever before, work has just permeated every part of our lives. One of the stats that you might have heard is that since email has come onto people's mobile phones, and I recognize that for a lot of you, that's been a fact of life your whole career. But what happened when that came onto people's mobile phones is that the average working day went up 2 hours a day. And so silently and without any negotiation and without any sort of discussion with us about how that would impact our lives, silently the working day increased by 25%. And the really interesting thing about that is that if you look at people who use email for 2 hours a day outside of their job, outside of their office, which I suspect is all of us, right? If you categorize their stress levels, maybe in the way that we look at the bars of signal on our phone. People who check their emails for 2 hours a day outside of the office, 3/4 of them are on 4 bars of stress. We've effectively systematized stress to the extent that all of us who check our emails all the time just live in stress. And you'll know it, actually. If someone says to you, how's it going? I suspect the answer is always busy, right? Busy. It's busy. It's busy. It's really busy. Stop asking, it's busy. And we find ourselves sort of perpetually sort of dashing around on adrenaline. The reason why that matters, I'm going to give you some evidence here, but what we find is that the evidence is that people who live all the time on that stress, on that adrenaline, on that cortisol, we find that they're unable to access creative thought. And I'm going to give you some evidence on that. But if any of us are thinking about the way that we're going to innovate our businesses, and all of us are charged with, as machine learning takes more and more parts of our jobs, we're all going to be charged with trying to be more innovative, imaginative. I'm sort of reluctant to use the word creative because we're scared of saying we're creative. But if all of us are charged with trying to be a bit more inventive and stress is preventing us from doing it, it's obviously something that all of us need to think about the consequence of. So machine learning, artificial intelligence, computers are coming for our jobs, and we need to be prepared that we're in the sweet spot where humans are better. Anytime I hear about machine learning and the computers taking over, I think of this tweet. I'll read this for you. It says, "The feeling when you realize the robots will steal your job." Right, so let me tell you, here's one interesting thing. Here's a remarkable thing. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about psychology and how our position in pecking orders has an impact on our whole psychology. So this is a really interesting thing. If you're interested in body language, there's a wonderful TED talk by a woman called Amy Cuddy, and she talks about these things, but she just reminds us that some of the things we're really aware of. Power is disinhibiting. So how might you know that? Because your dad used to really boss the house, right? The way he'd lounge around, or your boss, you might go into your boss's office and your boss has got his feet on his desk. Now, would you get your feet on the desk next to him? Unlikely. Why? Because power is disinhibiting. He doesn't feel the same inhibitions. And we see this all time and time again. We see examples of people in power who their behavior doesn't show the same reluctance, the same hesitation as other people. And so power is disinhibiting, and we see examples of it all the time. So what's the flip side of that? What's the flip side of power being disinhibiting? The absence of power is inhibiting. And this is really critical. I think any of us, so these are subservient apes in groups. So these are apes who are very much like at the bottom of the pecking order in their group. And what they do is they reduce their body size, they control themselves. Now, how might this manifest itself in work? Well, we find that if we don't believe our bosses are going to listen to us, we tend to withdraw a little. We tend to sort of stop making suggestions. We sort of behave in a subservient way. And these things happen throughout our work. So that's really critical for us to understand the relationship between the way leadership interacts and the way we feel when we have an absence of control. So the way it often manifests itself is that repression, controlling the way we feel, can lead to us behaving in a depressive fashion. And the way that projects itself into work is that we see stats like this. So you'll know these stats, Gallup workforce stats, 13% engagement of the British workforce. The thing that you might not know about this stat, so well established, it's not the lowest in the world. The stat in the US, by the way, is fantastic. It's like 30% of US workers are engaged. UK, 13% of workers are engaged. Lowest in the world is France, which is 1%. Zut alors. 1% of French workers are engaged in their job. There's an interesting thing there, though, because it's quite a hierarchical society, France. And so the absence of control, the absence of the autonomy of a degree of agency may well be reflected in this. The other thing about this is that twice as many people in the UK are actively disengaged in their job. So what that means is, just specifically, as you're getting on the tube at Barbican later today, look at all those people on the carriage. Twice as many of those people have set about going to work to bring down the downfall of their company. They see themselves as the Che Guevara of the spreadsheets. They're trying to undermine the very fabric of their organization. Twice as many as actually are trying to make it work. So this, for me, brings a really important question. So often when we're talking about purpose, yes, there's something in that and there's some evidence there, but often people just want to feel like they can get their job done. And it's actually a far simpler thing to do. I really think about work in two ways. I'm going to give you some evidence of these things. But I think about work in two ways. And if we neglect these, I think it has an impact. The importance of feeling connected. That's sort of like your signal, like how you interact with other people, and then your processor, how your brain deals with these things. And I was witnessing 51% of British workers are said to be in some state of burnout. I was witnessing that in the people I was working with. And it was largely, I think, because we were trying to put too much into their processor, and they were struggling to deal with it. So let me sort of talk you through the importance of connection. I think you'll see this exhibited a lot in the workplaces that we're in, because we're starting to see some evidence of when we disconnect people. So one example of why we might disconnect people is that if you find that you've got a work from home policy. Now look, I'm not remotely challenging work from home policies. They're incredibly empowering. But I think when we've got work from home policies, we need to think about the connection that has on the psychology of the people who work there. Strange thing about working from home is that the World Health Organization did a survey on working from home. The stress levels of people who work from home should be low, right? The stress levels of people who work from home is 70% higher than the people who work in offices. What they describe is they feel that their team don't like them and their boss doesn't trust them. The absence of being connected has a meaningful impact on our experience of work. There's a wonderful book by a guy called Johann Hari called Lost Connections, and he describes this really interesting thing. And it's like it's a really vivid image. He describes people who live alone wake up about 10 to 15 times a night, these like micro wakings. Why? Because when humans feel like we're away from other people, we naturally jar ourselves awake. Humans like to feel connected. And so what's the importance of that? We need to think, if people are working from home, what's the way that they can feel connected to their team? If people are hot desking, what's the way that we can make people feel like they've not lost something? I don't know if any of you work in hot desk environments, but a lot of people say, it doesn't feel the same. And it's because of that importance of connection. Next, I want to talk about the processor side of things. Processing, I think, is really critical. I'm going to give you two elements of this, just very brief insights into neuroscience. The first one is that I said to you I was witnessing burnout in the people I was working with. And in truth, a lot of that was probably me projecting my own burnout onto them as much as anything. Just people feeling overwhelmed with what they're trying to do. There was a really interesting insight that I witnessed that I think helped me understand what was going on. So I was one of those Monday night kitchen table emailers. I would get home, back-to-back meetings all day on Monday. I would get home and I would deal with my domestic responsibilities, and then I would start emailing. And I'd probably email from 8 p.m. till 11 p.m. every Monday night. But one Monday, I took stock of what I was doing. And I witnessed, I'd spent 10 minutes changing the music. I'd been going to get another cup of tea. I'd been coming back. I wasn't actually doing anything. And the next thing really gave me an insight. So this is a quotation from a guy called Daniel Levitin. And it's from a book called The Organised Mind. I'm going to be really clear now. This book is a terrible book. And I know the version of us that goes to conferences often thinks, you know what I need to do? I need to read more books. Do not buy this book. But he says this interesting thing. I'm going to read it for you. Then we're going to think about it. Then I'm going to read it again. Our brains are configured to make a certain number of decisions per day. And once we reach that limit, we can't make any more regardless of how important they are. Right. That's right. Now, so how would that manifest itself? You ever get yourself, like me, where you're sitting at the kitchen table doing those emails, and you just can't read this email, and you read it 3 times, and you think, it's just too long. Why does she write these long emails? But you think, I'll just answer. You can deal with a couple of the small emails, and then you go back to that long email. Like, I'll just get another cup of tea, and I'll come back and read. Is there any biscuits? You come back, and you sit there. I just can't take it in. Our brains are configured to make a certain number of decisions per day. And once we reach that limit, we're unable to make any more, regardless of how important they are. That's really interesting. I saw Andy Murray, greatest living British person, and he was describing 5-set tennis matches. Now, if you don't know anything about tennis, tennis is normally 3 sets for men and women around the world, but for the big tournaments, they play 5 sets. And so there's always a big debate. What's the difference? And he said, look, it's not the physicality. He was world number 1, let's not forget. It was not the physicality of them. He said, when you've been playing tennis for 5 hours, you reach a stage where your brain just starts making really bad decisions. It's really interesting. The science of this, if you're interested, is something called ego depletion. And while people quibble around the edges, they say that basically once our brain has been overloaded with making lots of decisions, we start just making random decisions. Really interesting. Do you ever recognize that? You come home and your flatmate or your partner or your friend will say to you, hey, just quickly, I was just thinking, can you just give me a minute? Can you just give me a minute? I just want 1 minute. Our brains are far more finite than we give them credit. As soon as you understand that, you start thinking, so just expecting my team to do 6 hours of meetings a day, then loads of emails, it's no wonder they feel overwhelmed. And it's not until we start making decisions about what we choose to do and what we choose not to do that we're going to actually allow them to do their job in a really full way. I mentioned really quickly that I was going to talk about the importance of stress, how stress kills creativity. And this is some evidence from a guy called Jaak Panksepp. Jaak Panksepp was a really interesting pioneering neuroscientist, and he did loads of work on rats. One of the things he did on rats is he said he categorized the systems of thinking in rats' brains. He said there's like 7 systems in all mammals' brains. And some of them are related to mating. Some of them are related to, he said one of them, about exploration, he called the seeking system. So this system in the brain, you've got to imagine it's like our desire to discover new things, our desire to test new things, seeking system. Another system he categorized was called the fear system, pretty self-evident. He wanted to know, do these things exist in a hierarchy against each other? He did this really interesting test. He said he basically got 2 rats, put them in a cage, and he counted how many times they did these patterns of seeking behavior. 5 minutes, they did 50 instances of seeking, pulling, biting, trying to crawl under things, until he put a piece of cat hair in their cage. They went from 50 instances of seeking to 0. But so stress, the fear, killed their desire to be creative, to explore, to do new things. The really interesting thing about that is he took the cat hair away, he cleaned the cages, he said it took 2 or 3 days for them to get back to 35 instances of seeking. So not only does stress kill our capacity to be creative, our desire to be creative, but it also has a stress hangover. Jack Pansap did a lot of other work, and one of the other things that he's down for, he's regarded as, he became fascinated with seeing if rats could laugh. And this is why the internet's a dangerous thing, is when I read that in a book, I thought, well, that's interesting, and I went to YouTube, and I found some of the videos of him making rats laugh. So, here we go. This from YouTube. So firstly, this is him tickling a rat. Now, what you're going to be listening to here is you're going to be listening to, imagine like one of those things that David Attenborough gets and he's listening to bats. He's got one of them and he's tuned it down a bit. So if you've got a rat at home, don't start tickling it thinking you're going to be regaled with this. He's hacked the sound. But let's hear this rat laugh. I know what you're thinking. Jesus, that's not laughing. Right, so here's what he said. He said, if I move my hand to the other side of the box, if the rat was loving it, the rat will probably follow my hand. Come on. That's a distraction. We didn't need to cover that, but I felt it would be helpful. So here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to look, and here's another reminder. You might say, I'm not convinced. Another quotation. The most concrete thing that neuroscience tells us is when the fear system of the brain is active, exploratory activity and risk-taking are turned off. Gregory Berns from Emory University. So we see sort of these things happening all the time. Now, I want to be practical. I said to you the challenge for me of a lot of this stuff is that I go back to my desk and I've got it really clearly on the brand new pad that I bought for this conference. I need to get the purpose thing going. And by the end of the first week, I'm like, I don't know how to do the purpose thing. What I want to do for you is show you practical things that anyone can do to start enjoying our work and enjoying our life again. And my objective, I was sort of had this ridiculous notion, I want to make the people I work with happier. And what I discovered was, as I set about doing that, I was just intent on exploring all the science. There's 2 ways to be happier in life, full stop. So effectively, while I'm going to give you 5 ways to love work again, I'm going to give you those 2 ways for free. So the number 1 way to be happier in your life, guaranteed, Prozac, on depression. Prozac is measured, depression is measured on a 51-point scale. I don't know why, 51 points. Prozac moves you 1.8 points on that scale. Sleep moves you 8 points. A good night's sleep is 5 times more effective than Prozac at making you happier. It's a really strange thing that sleep has gone through on the last few years. Sleep has, there might be people you know who say they only need 4 hours sleep a night. People getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to exercise, amazing. You might have seen these people. They're generally men who say that to you they don't need sleep. I don't need sleep. My favourite thing about this is that the biggest survey, neuroscientists were thinking maybe there's 2 different sorts of human brains. There's like the normal human brain, and maybe there's like these superhumans who don't need sleep. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan used to talk about 4 hours sleep a night. Donald Trump claims to not need much sleep. And And so intriguingly, they invited these people in to have their brain scanned. Now, you might have seen FRMI brain scanners. They're sort of like the big submarine and you slid on a bed. 3/4 of the people who claimed to only need 4 hours sleep a night fell asleep while their brains were being scanned. And I think we can conclude that broadly we all need sleep. So there's a brilliant thing. It's like the leading sleep scientist, a guy called Matthew Walker, he says that if someone told you something that was performance enhancing, reduced your chance of getting degenerative brain diseases, reduced your chance of getting a common cold, was gloriously enjoyable and made you more attractive, you'd be asking how much it cost. And the fact that sleep is so enjoyable and yet we're sort of so reluctant to have it seems so strange. Second way to be happier is a bit harder, and that is to get happier friends. Now, here's the challenge of this. Why do I say this? Spending time with happy people makes us happier. That's the fact, the evident fact. And I understand that we've all reached where we are in life, and we've now gathered a set of friends, haven't we? And some of our friends are happy, and some of our friends are sad, but you know, we don't want to abandon the sad friends. Of course, they need us. But the really interesting thing, my mum would sort of categorize it into drains and radiators. Did your mum do that, drains and radiators? I think she was trying to direct me towards certain friends and not others. She would say that drains, we recognise drains. They can be brilliantly sarcastically funny. They can be really sort of, you know, they've got their witty put down about anything. But any room that they're in, the temperature feels a little bit colder. Sort of, just the energy's not right. Radiators are those people, you know, right? You can imagine a radiator. If someone tells you that certain persons are coming on the night out, you immediately light up. Fantastic. We're going to have a good night. 2 cars are going there. 2 cabs are going there. You fight your way into the cab with the radiator. You're forgetting coats that never existed, so you don't have to get in the cab with the drain. You're scrambling your way. Spending time with happy people makes us happier. And of course, the only challenge of that is if you're married to a drain. Now, right, so let me give you 5 ways that we can think about using some of the things to practically improve our work. Here's number 1. Understand the way we think. This is really critical for me. I mentioned sort of thinking about our brains. If we were to do a really introductory GCSE level neuroscience, this is what we would learn day 1. There's broadly 3 systems of cognition in the brain. First one, the executive attention network. So that's you, and you're typing an email on your phone, okay? That's the executive attention network. Number 2 is the salience network. So you're there typing that email on your phone, but you're walking down the street. Okay? And the salience network is keeping you safe. It's your sort of force field that's stopping you bumping into other people. Right now, it's telling you that this room, nothing unpredictable is going on in this room. It's keeping you safe. The third one is the default network. And neuroscience, brain scanning, is actually a relatively new science. With any sophistication, it's the last 20 years. And what used to happen was they would give someone something to do in the scanner, and they would watch what happened when they stopped doing it. Now, it would suggest to them that, you know, when you stop doing something, that your brain would stop lighting up. But people's brains were still lighting up, but in different areas. So they asked people, what's going on in your brain right now? And people said, oh, I was just a million miles away. I was just daydreaming. I wasn't thinking of anything. But here's the strange thing. When we appear to have our best creative ideas is not when we're in this intense period of focus. We often have our best ideas when we're in this unfocused stage, in sort of this daydreamy stage, when we're a million miles away. Someone said to me, yeah, that's interesting. I have all my best ideas staring out the window of the train. Someone said I have my best ideas walking the dog, always walking the dog. My favourite example of it is the writer Aaron Sorkin. He's written films like Moneyball, Social Network. He wrote The West Wing. He's got a new play starting in the West End, an adaptation of To Kill a Mockingbird. He's written loads of stuff, very famous for really good dialogue. He realised he was having his best ideas, not while he was staring into his laptop screen, but while he was in the shower. He said he had a shower installed in the corner of his office. He has 6 to 8 showers a day. What are they going to say at your work when you start having 6? But really interesting. Why is that relevant? Because it means if all you're doing is being busy, don't be surprised if you're one of the people who says, you know, I only really have ideas when I'm on holiday now. I only really have ideas, occasionally when I've sort of taken a day off and right, because you're cramming all of the thinking out of your head. And being too busy is the enemy of being creative. Here's another one. I mentioned the importance of feeling connected to our teams, of feeling like we're plugged into something. But I want to show you how important that is. Here's a really interesting piece of work. It was done by a guy called Robin Dunbar, quite a famous psychologist. He did some work with Oxford University rowers. So you've seen these on TV, sort of big, 6'6", strapping athletes. He did an interesting thing. How does feeling connected change our experience? So the first experiment was that he took all these rowers, he put a group of them randomly on rowing machines. He said, can you just row for 10 minutes? They're all competitive. They all rowed as hard as they could. Put another group in a different room. And he set them up like this, like a boat. And he said, you have to row in time with each other. That was the only difference. At the end of the 10 minutes, they'd done about the same level of exercise. But he measured the endorphin levels, the pleasure hormone levels in their bodies. Those who'd rowed in time with each other had twice the endorphin levels of those who hadn't. Why? Because feeling connected to other people is a transformational experience. And so I've witnessed organizations that set about trying to do this. One organization introduced Crisp Thursday. Thursday at 4:30, they just invited anyone to come and help themselves to plates laid out with Pringles, kettle chips. It seems almost so banal that how could it have any impact? But what it did is it just tapped into our desire to feel connected to others. It's sort of like the pub used to do. Our desire to plug into other people. It's transformational. And especially if you've got people working remotely, this is what you start to lose. I'll give you another example of this. So this is taking that same idea and applying it to an actual workplace. One of the things we've been able to do in the last few years is that the technology has allowed us to measure what goes on in offices. So if anyone watches live sport, you'll occasionally see heat maps of where players go on pitches, or you just see activity levels of what they do. And someone said, how about we do that for an office? And they started tracking how offices interacted. Really brilliant guy, I've written about it, but really brilliant guy who initiated it. We started learning a lot about what goes on in workplaces. And they took some of the science, and so some of the science there, the guy who does it, says that face-to-face conversations are one of the most impactful things in workplaces. It's really interesting, because we're gradually eliminating face-to-face conversations, right? But one of the most productivity and creativity stimulating things. So they thought, well, what can they do in a real workplace? So they introduced this at a call center. So the way that a call center works, we're now a call center. The way that a call center previously worked is randomly people were given 15-minute breaks. Now what they said is, how about if we send people in breaks in blocks of 20 people? So rather than just going, so they're allowed 15 minutes break in the morning, 15 minutes break in the afternoon. I wonder what will happen if it becomes a social experience rather than an individual one. Here's what happened. So it was a 15-minute intervention. That was already taking place. So actually, it was exactly the same. But by turning it into something social, by allowing people to connect with each other, first thing that happened is stress levels dropped 19% compared to the other group. When people feel connected to each other, it's what the human experience is like. We actually feel like we're sharing this burden. But here's what they hadn't expected. The performance levels went up 23%. And that's largely because people turned into coaches for each other. Someone would say, I've just had the worst phone call ever. And the person next to them would say, when that happens, I say this. And immediately they coached each other. 23% increase in performance based on that. Remarkable. And it's just a good reminder, when people feel connected to each other, it transforms our experience. It doesn't need to feel too complicated. Actually making people feel plugged into something bigger than themselves. I'll give you two more. This is the importance of, we might hear things, bring your whole self to work. And you'll be sitting at your desk thinking, I just don't know how to do it. Let me give you one simple way to do it. So this was a piece of work done by Dan Cable at London Business School. And he introduced this as a card that was given to everyone on their first day as they sat together. So if they were bringing 15, 20 people into a company or 6 people into a company, on their first day, they were given this one exercise for 15 minutes. What's unique about you that leads to your happiest times at work? Reflect on a specific time when you were acting in the way you were born to act. That's it. In fact, just to reveal the technique, quite often when researchers do things like this, they do a first experiment, it doesn't work, and then they perfect it. This was the first experiment they did. And it was done over several thousand people. It was so effective that, in fact, they've thought of ways to evolve it since. But this, for me, is like a very simple thing to introduce. They introduced this in a big technology company. And first thing that happened was that people, their likelihood of staying in their job went up 50%. So the 2-year tenure of these people was 50% higher. The second thing was that the people who did this, their customers they dealt with, their customer satisfaction went up by about 12%. So effectively, by allowing people to be a bit weirder straight out of the box, allow them to bring their personality to their interactions with customers. So when we hear about bring your whole self to work, for me, it's about what are the small baby steps that we can do to get us on that way. I'm going to show you the final thing, and this is really the importance of belonging. And for me, if there's one element of the whole of psychology that we often neglect, it's this. It's when any of us are feeling we don't feel connected with our team anymore, we don't feel our work just doesn't feel as welcoming as our favourite ever jobs. I think this is the critical thing. I'll give you, I guess the reason why I feel that this matters is that we often hear things that are counter to it. So we often hear the likes of Reid Hastings, and he'll say, he's the guy who set up Netflix, look, formidable innovation. But one of the things in the Netflix culture deck, a few of you might have read that document, he says we're a team, not a family. A really interesting difference, because he says in a team, people get fired from the team and you move on, you deal with it. A family, you never fire your mum. And so he believes there's a big difference. No matter how bad Christmas goes, you never fire your mum. And so he believes there's a big difference. But I take issue with that because I'm not convinced that the best team cultures have that separation. I'll give you one start point for this. So I'll take a step back to the importance of belongingness first. This is Frederick II. He's the Holy Roman Emperor in the 12th century. He ran a kingdom sort of through Germany, Italy, down to Jerusalem. He sort of ran this vast kingdom. But he was way ahead of his time for A/B testing. We all think A/B testing came in the internet era. Let me talk you through some of his experiments. So one of his A/B tests was that he got a couple of peasants from the local village. And he gave them both big evening meals. He wanted to know how our digestive system works, which for a 12th century dude is pretty advanced, right? He wanted to know how our digestive system works. He sent 2 peasants out with a full meal. He gave them both a full meal. He sent one of them out, actually, on a hunting expedition. The other one, he said, go and get a good night's sleep. When the huntsman returned at dawn, he woke them both up. And he wanted to see who had digested more food. So the way to do that was kill them and just cut them open, have a quick look, and he was able to see who'd eaten more food. One of his other experiments, though, he teaches us something about belonging. So he was convinced that in the same way dogs bark, cats meow, birds chirp, they've all got no one teaches them these languages. Why are we teaching humans a language? They must have a native language. He wanted to know what language human babies would speak if we didn't teach them anything. Only way to find out was he took a group of babies from their mums, newborn babies from their mums, and he gave them to his helpers. He said, just feed them, but don't look at them, don't cuddle them, don't engage with them in any way. He's waiting to see when this new language would start babbling forth. And all of the babies died. And the strange thing is that we might struggle to look at the maths of that and go, well, we gave them all the things required. And if any of us know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you might remember it from school. It was like food, shelter. The next level was belongingness. But the strange thing is that whenever anyone has tried to measure that and test whether that's true, we've struggled to see any difference between food, shelter, and belongingness. In fact, the biggest paper that I've seen on it, really brilliant paper by these 2 guys, Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary. And they look into the science of it. And they say basically we can't find any examples where belongingness doesn't matter as much as food and shelter. Much of what human beings do is done in the service of belongingness. There's been loads of work on this. One of the best pieces of work was done by this woman, Julianne Holt-Lunstad, and she looked at 3.4 million adults. She said loneliness is a bigger killer than obesity. Being lonely is about the equivalent of smoking 15 to 20 cigarettes a day. She said effectively that if we allow people to be lonely, we're having a bigger health impact on them than almost anything else. And you might think, why is that relevant to work? Well, 42% of British workers, so that's got to include some of our colleagues, 42% of British workers say they don't have a single friend at work. So we've created a version of modern work that, despite what we might tell ourselves at glorious events like this, a lot of people feel lonely, alienated, and disconnected. So even if we only did one thing, making people feel like they're plugged into something seems really critical. So I gave you these 5 things. Thinking about how we think, think of Aaron Sorkin in the shower. Think about like that default mode. Think about how we team. So that was the rowers who felt connected to other rowers. They actually had a completely transformed experience. Then applying that, the relaxation, taking a tea break, seemed to be taking that science and actually enhancing people's jobs by giving them enforced downtime. Whether it's crisp Thursday, whether it's a tea break, whatever it is, it's trying to bring a connectedness. The importance of settling, so the importance of people feeling like they can be their full selves. Why? Because it's been modeled to them from their first day. And the final thing, probably the most important thing, is that importance of belonging. I think any of us, I used to work at a tech firm, right, till 3 weeks ago, and people used to say, what's the future of work? And they would believe that the future of work was going to be in the form of technology. The future of work was going to be a new app or a new system that we're using. And I want to be really clear that from someone who's worked in those environments, someone who's seen the misdirection of neon-coloured slides and people trying to claim out that that's good culture, I want to be really clear. The future of work isn't technology. The future of work is about humanity. Thank you very much.